The television industry has witnessed countless dramatic moments over the decades, but what transpired on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon would forever alter the trajectory of daytime programming. When a 74-year-old man named Robert Chambers walked onto the Dr. Phil stage, nobody could have anticipated that his presence would create a silence so profound that even the seasoned host would find himself utterly unable to speak. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every excruciating second as Dr. Phil McGraw stood motionless, his clipboard slipping from his grasp, his eyes fixed on something that defied all rational explanation. The morning had begun without any indication of the earthquake about to strike. Production assistants moved through their routines with practiced efficiency. Coffee machines hummed in the green room. Makeup artists powdered faces under bright lights. The day's schedule promised nothing extraordinary. Just another episode addressing family dysfunction, reconciliation attempts, and the psychological wounds that time refuses to heal. The guest list included a mother estranged from her daughter, a couple struggling with infidelity, and tucked into the final segment, a story about brothers who hadn't communicated in 3 decades. Robert Chambers had submitted his application to the show almost a year earlier. His submission letter contained none of the dramatic flair that typically catches a producer's attention. There were no threats, no shocking revelations in capital letters, no desperate pleas for intervention. Instead, Robert wrote with the measured tone of someone who had spent 30 years thinking about every word he might one day speak. He explained that he needed to find his younger brother, Thomas. He mentioned that circumstances beyond their control had driven them apart. He concluded with a simple sentence that somehow conveyed more pain than 1,000 emotional outbursts ever could. Robert wrote that he wanted his brother to know the truth before either of them ran out of time. The production team filed his request alongside hundreds of others. Weeks became months. Then one afternoon, a researcher named Jennifer stumbled across Robert's file while searching for something else entirely. She read his letter 3 times, feeling something shift in her understanding of what made a story worth telling. Jennifer brought the file to her supervisor, who brought it to the senior producer, who eventually brought it to Dr. Phil himself. After reviewing the sparse details Robert had provided, Dr. Phil made a decision that would haunt him in the best possible way. He approved the segment, but he made one critical mistake. He didn't dig deep enough into the background. He didn't investigate what had actually happened 3 decades ago. He assumed, as everyone did, that this would be another family reconciliation, emotional but manageable, the kind of story the show handled regularly. Thomas Chambers had no idea his brother was searching for him. At 68 years old, Thomas had built a life carefully constructed around forgetting. He lived in a modest home in Sacramento, California, worked as a retired postal worker, and spent his weekends tending a garden that had won local awards for its roses. He was married to a woman named Diane, had 3 children, and 7 grandchildren, who called him Papa. By every external measure, Thomas Chambers was a man at peace. But Diane knew better. She had learned over 4 decades of marriage that there were questions she must never ask. She knew that certain dates on the calendar would find Thomas sitting alone in his workshop, staring at nothing, his hands still but his mind clearly traveling to places she couldn't follow. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening. Thomas was washing dinner dishes when Diane answered. She listened for a moment, her expression shifting from pleasant curiosity to something approaching alarm. She covered the receiver and turned to her husband, her voice carefully neutral in that way that immediately signals something serious. "Thomas," she said quietly, "it's someone from the Dr. Phil show. They want to talk to you about your brother." Thomas dropped the plate he was holding. It shattered against the tile floor in an explosion of porcelain that seemed to echo through the entire house. He stood there, hands dripping soapy water, staring at his wife as though she had just announced the world was ending. After 30 years of silence, after 3 decades of carefully maintained distance, the past had finally found him. What Thomas didn't know was that Robert had made his own phone call to the show 3 days earlier. Robert had provided additional information, details he hadn't included in his original letter, information so sensitive that the production team immediately elevated his case to Dr. Phil personally. Robert explained that the estrangement wasn't about a simple family argument or a dispute over inheritance or any of the common fractures that split siblings apart. What had happened in 1994 involved a tragedy, a misunderstanding, and a secret that Robert had carried alone for 30 years. He told the producers that Thomas believed something about him that wasn't true, something so fundamentally wrong that it had poisoned everything between them. Robert said he had proof, documentation that would change everything, but he needed to present it in person. He needed his brother to see his face when the truth finally emerged. Dr. Phil made a decision that broke protocol. He decided not to inform Thomas that Robert would be in the studio. The producers argued against it. Ambushing guests could backfire spectacularly, creating trauma rather than healing. But Dr. Phil believed, based on the information Robert had shared, that seeing each other without warning might be the only way to break through 3 decades of reinforced walls. It was a calculated risk, the kind that either produces breakthrough moments or catastrophic failures. There is no middle ground when you're gambling with people's deepest wounds. The day of filming arrived with California sunshine that seemed almost aggressive in its cheerfulness. Thomas sat in the green room, his hands clasped so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. Diane sat beside him, occasionally placing her hand on his knee, a gesture of support that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he was facing. A production assistant brought water, made small talk, explained the basic format of the show. Thomas nodded mechanically, hearing nothing. He had agreed to come on the show to explain publicly why he had cut his brother from his life. He had prepared a statement, rehearsed it in his bathroom mirror a dozen times. He was ready to tell America why some betrayals are unforgivable, why some distances must be maintained, why forgiveness isn't always the answer that everyone wants it to be. Robert arrived separately, entering through a different entrance. The production team kept the brothers isolated from each other, a logistical ballet designed to prevent premature contact. Robert carried a worn leather briefcase, the kind professionals used in the 1980s before everyone switched to nylon messenger bags. He held it close to his chest as though it contained his heart. In a way, it did. Inside that briefcase were documents that represented 30 years of investigation, of tracking down records, of piecing together a truth that had been deliberately hidden. Robert had spent a significant portion of his retirement savings on private investigators, lawyers, and researchers. He had followed dead ends and false leads. He had knocked on doors and made phone calls and sent letters that went unanswered. But he had persisted because he loved his brother, and he couldn't bear the thought of dying with Thomas still believing a lie. The show began with its usual energy. Dr. Phil emerged to applause, his presence commanding the studio with that particular authority that comes from decades of being trusted with people's most vulnerable moments. He introduced the topic with broad strokes. "Today we're discussing family estrangements," he announced, looking directly into the camera. "We're talking about brothers who were once inseparable, who protected each other as children, who swore they would always have each other's backs. And then something happened that created a silence lasting 30 years. The audience leaned forward collectively, drawn by the promise of drama and hopefully resolution. Thomas was brought out first. He walked slowly, his body language broadcasting discomfort and determination in equal measure. The audience offered sympathetic applause as he settled into the chair across from Dr. Phil. "Thomas," Dr. Phil began with genuine warmth. "Thank you for being willing to talk about this publicly. I know this isn't easy. Tell us about your brother." Thomas took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "His name is Robert," Thomas said quietly. "He's 6 years older than me. When we were kids, he was everything to me. My father died when I was 7, and Robert basically raised me. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, how to talk to girls. He was at my high school graduation, my wedding, the birth of my first child." Dr. Phil nodded encouragingly. "That sounds like a close relationship. What happened?" Thomas's expression hardened. "In 1994, my youngest daughter Emma was 16 years old. She was a good kid, responsible, got good grades. She started acting different that summer, withdrawn, secretive. We thought it was normal teenage stuff. Then one night she broke down and told us what had been happening." Thomas paused, his jaw working. "She said that Robert had been inappropriate with her, that he had touched her in ways that were wrong, that he had been doing it for months." The studio went completely silent. This wasn't what anyone had expected. The audience members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Dr. Phil's expression shifted into the professional gravity he reserves for the darkest revelations. "Thomas," Dr. Phil said carefully, "those are serious allegations. What did you do?" "I did what any father would do," Thomas replied, his voice gaining strength from anger. "I confronted Robert immediately. He denied everything. Said Emma was lying, that she was confused, that I was believing a teenage girl over my own brother. We had a fight, a physical fight. I told him he was dead to me. I filed a police report. The investigation went nowhere because it was her word against his. No physical fivers, nothing the district attorney thought they could prosecute. But I didn't need a conviction to know the truth. I knew my daughter. She wouldn't lie about something like that." Dr. Phil leaned back. Processing. And you've had no contact with Robert since then? None, Thomas confirmed. He's tried to reach out over the years. Letters I've returned unopened. Phone calls I've blocked. He showed up at my house once, and I called the police. As far as I'm concerned, the brother I loved died in 1994. The man who did that to my daughter is a stranger I want nothing to do with. The audience murmured in support. This was clear-cut, or so it seemed. A father protecting his child, maintaining boundaries against an abuser, refusing to let family ties excuse the inexcusable. Dr. Phil looked at Thomas with sympathy. I understand why you've maintained that boundary, but Thomas, I need to tell you something. Your brother Robert is here, he's backstage, and he's asked for the opportunity to speak with you. Thomas went rigid, his face flushed red, then drained to an alarming pale. No, he said, shaking his head. No, I didn't agree to this. I came here to explain why I cut him off. Not to see him. Dr. Phil raised a calming hand. I understand this is difficult, but Robert says he has information that you need to hear, information that changes everything about what you believe happened. Thomas stood up, ripping off his microphone. I don't care what he has to say. Lies. All lies. I'm leaving. Before Thomas could step off the stage, the backstage curtain moved. Robert Chambers walked out. He moved carefully, like a man approaching a wild animal that might bolt. The briefcase remained clutched against his chest. Thomas froze mid-step, seeing his brother for the first time in 30 years. The camera caught everything, the shock on Thomas's face, the raw hope and fear on Robert's, the way time seemed to collapse and expand simultaneously. They looked like mirror images, separated by time and grief. Robert was older, grayer, more stooped, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Tommy, Robert said, using a nickname no one had spoken in decades. Please, just listen. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Thomas stood there, trembling. The audience held its collective breath. Dr. Phil remained silent, understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a host can do is nothing. Tommy, I didn't do what Emma said I did. Robert's voice cracked. I swear on our father's grave I never touched that girl. I love her like she's my own daughter. I would die before I hurt her. Thomas's laugh was bitter and broken. 30 years, Robert. 30 years to come up with a better lie, and that's all you've got. Robert's hands shook as he opened the briefcase. That's why I needed to see you face to face. Because I don't have lies, Tommy. I have the truth. And the truth is so much worse than you know, but it has nothing to do with me. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents. Do you remember Emma's boyfriend that summer, Jason Mitchell? Thomas frowned, thrown by the question. Yes. Of course. They dated for about a year. Nice kid. Why? Because Jason Mitchell wasn't a nice kid, Robert said quietly. He was a 22-year-old man who knew exactly what he was doing when he targeted a 16-year-old girl. Phil leaned forward, his entire demeanor shifting. The cameras zoomed in, catching every micro-expression. Robert continued, his words coming faster now. 3 decades of pressure finally finding release. After you cut me off, I couldn't let it go. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but I also knew Emma believed something had happened to her. So I hired a private investigator, not to prove Emma was lying, but to find out what actually happened. Why she would say those things about me. The investigator started looking into everyone in Emma's life that summer. He pulled the folder open, extracting photographs, documents, highlighted sections of text. Jason Mitchell had a record, nothing that would show up on a basic background check. But if you dig deeper, if you really look, you find a pattern. Girls aged 15 to 17, grooming, manipulation. Statutory rape charges that were dropped when families were paid off. Thomas reached for the chair behind him, gripping it for support. Robert handed him a photograph. This was taken at a party in July 1994. Jason Mitchell's apartment. Emma's in the background. Thomas stared at the photo, his hands shaking. Robert continued relentlessly, the truth pouring out like water from a broken dam. The investigator interviewed people who were at that party. Emma was drinking. She was upset. She was with Jason. He gave her something. Ecstasy, probably, based on witness accounts. What happened that night? Tommy, what Emma remembers happening. It wasn't me. It was Jason Mitchell. But she was drugged. She was traumatized. and somehow in her mind her memories got confused. When she came to you crying, she genuinely believed what she was saying. She wasn't lying. Her memory was just wrong. Dr. Phil's voice cut through. Robert, these are extraordinary claims. What evidence do you have beyond witness statements from 30 years ago? Robert pulled out more documents. I found Jason Mitchell. He's in prison now, in Nevada, serving 20 years for sexual assault of a minor. Different victim, different state, but same pattern. I hired a lawyer. We got Emma's medical records from that summer, with her written permission. She was treated at an emergency room in August 1994 for symptoms consistent with date rape drugs. The hospital record lists Jason Mitchell as the person who brought her in. Thomas collapsed into the chair, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Dr. Phil spoke gently. Thomas. Did you know about the hospital visit? Thomas shook his head mutely. Emma never told us. She must have gone alone, or with Jason. Robert's voice softened. I have Emma's written statement, Tommy. From 2 months ago, she found me. After all these years, she found me. And she told me, she's been having recovered memories, working with a therapist. She remembers the party now. She remembers Jason. She remembers being terrified and confused, and when your wife asked her what was wrong, your wife asked if anyone had hurt her, and the only name that came to her traumatized mind was mine because I was safe. I was family. It was easier to accuse someone she knew loved her than to confront what had actually happened with someone who had deliberately violated her. Dr. Phil turned to Thomas. Did Emma know you were coming on the show today? Thomas shook his head. I didn't tell her. I didn't want to drag her through this again. Robert reached into his briefcase one final time. She asked me to give you this, if I ever got the chance. He held out an envelope, cream-colored, Thomas's name written in familiar handwriting. Thomas took it with shaking hands. He opened it slowly, pulled out several pages of handwritten text. His eyes moved across the words, tears beginning to stream down his face. The cameras captured him reading, but the audience couldn't see the words. Only Thomas knew what his daughter had written. Only he could read her apology, her explanation, her desperate request for him to forgive his brother, to undo the damage her traumatized 16-year-old brain had accidentally caused. When Thomas finally looked up, his face was destroyed. Dr. Phil waited. The silence in the studio was absolute, profound, sacred in its completeness. Robert stood motionless, barely breathing, waiting for his brother's verdict after 30 years in exile.
I'm sorry, Thomas whispered.
The words barely audible pulled from somewhere so deep they seemed to hurt coming out. Robert, I'm so sorry. What followed happened so quickly that the cameras almost missed it. Thomas stood, moved toward his brother, and the two men collided in an embrace that looked almost violent in its intensity. They held each other the way drowning men hold life preservers, the way soldiers hold each other after surviving battle, the way brothers hold each other when 30 years of wrongful separation finally ends. Both men sobbed openly, their bodies shaking with the force of emotions too large for any container. Dr. Phil wiped his own eyes. The studio audience cried collectively, makeup running, tissues appearing from purses. Even the hardened camera operators, men and women who had seen everything over decades in television, found themselves unable to maintain professional detachment. This wasn't entertainment. This was sacred ground. Holy ground, the kind of moment that reminds everyone watching that beneath all the noise and distraction of modern life, there are still things that matter absolutely. After several minutes, the brothers separated enough to look at each other. Thomas cupped Robert's face in his hands. 30 years, he said brokenly. I stole 30 years from us. Because I didn't tank them. Dirty. Because I was so sure. So absolutely certain. Robert shook his head. You protected your daughter. That's what fathers do. You believed her, supported her, defended her. That's exactly what you should have done. Thomas pulled the letter from his pocket. She blames herself. Emma blames herself for all of this. Robert's expression filled with pain. I know, she called me 3 months ago, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. I told her the same thing I'm telling you. She was a child. She was victimized. None of this is her fault. Dr. Phil finally spoke, his voice rough. Robert, you spent 30 years and how much money proving your innocence? Robert shrugged. Doesn't matter, not compared to getting my brother back. Thomas gripped his brother's shoulders. You have more than that. You have me. You have Emma. You have my wife, my kids, my grandchildren. You have all of us. for whatever time we have left. Robert broke down again. Tommy, I've missed you every single day. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time something good happened or something bad happened, I wanted to call you. I wanted my little brother back. The show moved backstage, to a private room where the cameras continued filming, but the audience was excluded. Dr. Phil sat with both brothers, facilitating a conversation that would stretch for over 3 hours, though only portions would ever air. They talked about missed milestones. Robert had never met 3 of Thomas's grandchildren. Thomas had missed Robert's retirement party, his 60th birthday, the death of Robert's wife, 5 years earlier. They calculated the time lost, the holidays absent, the phone calls never made, the support never offered during hard times. But they also talked about Jason Mitchell. Dr. Phil brought in an expert on trauma and memory, who explained to Thomas how it was possible for Emma's memories to have been genuinely mistaken. The expert described how trauma affects the brain, how drugs can scramble memory formation, how a frightened teenager's mind might substitute a safe person for an unsafe one in an attempt to process overwhelming horror. The expert emphasized that Emma hadn't lied, she had simply been wrong, and that distinction mattered enormously. Thomas asked the question that had been haunting him since reading Emma's letter. Is my daughter okay? Robert nodded slowly. She's been in therapy for 3 years. She's doing the work, facing what really happened. She's angry at Jason Mitchell. She's grieving the relationship she lost with me. She's dealing with guilt over what happened between us. But yes, Tommy, she's okay. She's strong, like her father. Thomas covered his face with his hands. I need to talk to her. Robert pulled out his phone. She's waiting. She asked me to call her if today went well. She wants to talk to both of us. What happened next was filmed but never aired at the family's request. Emma appeared on video call, her face older but still recognizably the girl Thomas remembered. The conversation between father, daughter, and uncle lasted 45 minutes. There were tears, apologies, explanations, and ultimately something that looked like the beginning of healing. Emma told her father she loved him, that his protection of her all those years ago had been exactly what she needed, even if it had been directed at the wrong person. She told Robert she was sorry seemed impossibly inadequate, but she had no other words sufficient to the moment. Robert told Emma that she had nothing to apologize for, that she had survived something terrible, and he was proud of her for having the courage to seek truth, even when it was painful. Before the call ended, Emma made a request. Dad, Uncle Robert, I want us all together. Thanksgiving is in 6 weeks. Please, can we have Thanksgiving together, like we used to when I was little? Thomas looked at his brother, 30 years of separation reflected in his eyes. Robert smiled through tears. We'll be there, sweetheart. We'll all be there. The episode that eventually aired became one of the most watched in Dr. Phil's history. But what viewers saw was carefully edited, sanitized for public consumption, while protecting the family's privacy. The full story, the complete emotional devastation and reconstruction, remained private. Dr. Phil made that choice deliberately, understanding that some moments are too sacred to be fully commodified, even in the name of education or awareness. In his closing statement, Dr. Phil addressed the camera directly. Today you witnessed something extraordinary. 2 brothers reunited after 30 years. But here's what I want you to understand. This reunion was possible because Robert Redder stopped searching for truth, because Emma had the courage to face her trauma and recover her real memories. Because Thomas was willing to listen even when every instinct told him to walk away. The lesson isn't just about false accusations or mistaken memories. The lesson is about the power of truth, the importance of thorough investigation, and the possibility of redemption even when situations seem absolutely hopeless. He paused, letting the weight settle. If you're estranged from someone you love, I'm not telling you to automatically reconcile. Some estrangements are necessary and healthy. But I am telling you to absolutely certain you have the truth. Make sure you're not letting pride or pain or assumptions block you from facts that might change everything, because time is finite. Robert and Thomas got lucky. They got their reunion before either of them died. Not everyone does. The aftermath rippled through multiple lives. Thomas and Robert began the slow work of rebuilding their relationship, starting with weekly phone calls, then monthly visits, then that promised Thanksgiving dinner that included 3 generations of family. Emma continued her therapy, finding peace in knowing the truth had finally emerged. Diane welcomed Robert back into the family, apologizing for the years she had supported her husband's estrangement without question. The grandchildren met their great-uncle, listening to stories about their grandfather as a young man. Jason Mitchell remained in prison, where he belonged. The family contacted his victim, offering support and solidarity. They shared information with law enforcement, helping to establish patterns that might prevent Mitchell from ever being released. They turned their pain into action, their reunion into purpose. Dr. Phil kept in touch with the family, checking in periodically over the following years. He received photos of family gatherings, updates on grandchildren's accomplishments, and eventually, a wedding invitation. Emma was getting married, and she wanted both her father and her uncle to walk her down the aisle. Dr. Phil attended that wedding, filming nothing, simply present as a guest, who had played a role in bringing a family back together. Years later, when Dr. Phil reflected on that day in the studio, he described it as one of the most important moments of his career, not because of ratings or awards or public recognition, but because it reminded him why the work mattered. "We can't change the past," he said during an interview. Robert and Thomas can't get back those 30 years. Emma can't undo her trauma, but they can choose how they move forward. They can choose truth over comfortable lies. They can choose connection over isolation. They can choose forgiveness over bitterness. And those choices, made daily, can transform even the most devastating situations into something bearable, maybe even something beautiful. The frozen moment captured on camera, when Dr. Phil first saw Robert emerge and recognized the magnitude of what was about to unfold, became emblematic of the entire story. Sometimes the right response to overwhelming truth is silence. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop, absorb, and acknowledge that you're witnessing something that transcends television, transcends entertainment, transcends anything scripted or planned. You're witnessing the raw, messy, complicated, beautiful reality of human beings trying desperately to find their way back to each other across chasms that seemed impossible to bridge. And that, ultimately, is what makes stories like this matter. Not the drama, not the tears, not the theatrical elements that make good television. What matters is the truth, the hard, complicated, sometimes teasing truth that sets people free even when the freedom comes with pain attached. Robert spent 30 years and his life savings pursuing that truth. Thomas spent 30 years imprisoned by a false certainty. Emma spent 30 years carrying guilt for something beyond her control. But when truth finally emerged, when all parties faced it directly, healing became possible. The photograph that Robert carried in his briefcase, the one showing Emma at that party, became evidence in Jason Mitchell's case. Other victims came forward, emboldened by the family's willingness to speak publicly about trauma and false memories. The story created ripples that extended far beyond one family's reconciliation, touching courtrooms and therapy offices and living rooms across the country. Dr. Phil uses the story in professional presentations now, discussing the intersection of trauma, memory, and justice. He emphasizes the importance of thorough investigation, the danger of certainty unsupported by complete evidence, and the complicated reality that people can be genuinely mistaken about even their most vivid memories. He shows that photograph of two brothers embracing after 30 years, their faces wet with tears, their bodies shaking with emotion too large to contain, and he tells audiences that this is what truth looks like when it finally breaks through lies and assumptions and fear. Thomas and Robert have 11 years together before Robert passes away peacefully in his sleep. Thomas is holding his hand when it happens, having maintained a vigil in the hospital for 3 days. The funeral is attended by dozens of family members, including Emma, who delivers a eulogy describing the uncle who loved her enough to spend 30 years proving his innocence, not to punish her, but to free her from false guilt. "It's a love story," she tells the gathered mourners, "just not the kind anyone expects. It's about a man who loved his brother and his niece enough to never give up on truth, even when truth seemed impossible to find." When Thomas dies 4 years later, he is buried beside his brother, their graves marked with simple headstones bearing names, dates, and a single shared phrase, "Brothers, finally home." Emma visits regularly, bringing loaves, talking to them both, thanking them for teaching her that truth matters more than comfort, that love persists even through decades of separation, that families can break and heal again, and each time they choose healing, they become stronger in the broken places. Dr. Phil's moment of frozen silence in that studio lasted perhaps 5 seconds in real time, but those 5 seconds contained universes of meaning, represented crossroads where lives could have gone different directions, embodied the weight of 3 decades of separation about to potentially end. That silence was respect for the magnitude of the moment. It was acknowledgement that sometimes television accidentally captures something so real, so raw, so fundamentally human, that the only appropriate response is to stop performing and simply witness. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson from that day when a 74-year-old man walked onto a stage, carrying a briefcase full of truth that would shatter and rebuild an entire family. Some sums are bigger than the medium containing them. Some stories refuse to be contained by their format. Some truths are so powerful that they transform everyone they touch, from the people directly involved, to the camera operators filming, to the millions watching at home. Truth arrived 30 years late for Robert and Thomas Chambers, but it arrived nonetheless, carried in a worn leather briefcase by a man who refused to accept exile for crimes he didn't commit. And when that truth tearfully emerged into light, it proved powerful enough to undo decades of damage, powerful enough to reunite brothers, powerful enough to heal a family, and powerful enough to remind everyone watching that it's never too late for truth to matter, for love to persist, for reconciliation to occur. The silence in that studio when Dr. Phil froze wasn't empty. It was full of everything that matters: grief and hope, pain and healing, endings and beginnings. 30 years of separation, and the promise of however much time remained to make new memories together. And sometimes that's what we need most from our stories. Not noise but silence, not distraction but truth, not entertainment but transformation. Sometimes we need to be reminded that beneath all the chaos and complexity of human existence, there are still moments when truth wins, love persists, and brothers find their way home to each other however long the journey takes.